People think betrayal announces itself. They think you'll feel it coming, like a storm before it hits. But the truth is, the worst kind of betrayal is quiet. It wears your husband's face. It sleeps beside you every night, and you don't find out until one ordinary Wednesday morning when you're pouring yourself a second cup of coffee and his phone buzzes face up on the kitchen counter. My name is Laurel Haynes. I'm 32 years old, and for 6 years I was a woman who thought love meant shrinking yourself to fit into someone else's idea of what you should be. I was a physical therapist working at a sports rehab clinic in Charlotte, North Carolina. My husband worked in commercial real estate. We had a townhouse with a craftsman front door had painted myself, a rescue dog named Fig, and a life that looked from the outside like something worth envying. But before I tell you how I got everything back, like and subscribe, and drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from. When my husband and I got married, I was 26. He was 30, already established, already certain about everything. That certainty was what I loved about him at first. When you're 26 and still figuring out who you are, someone who seems to know exactly where he's going feels like an anchor. I didn't realize until much later that anchors don't move. And if you're tied to one, neither do you. The first few years were good. Not perfect, but genuinely good. We went on road trips. We argued about which Netflix show to watch and cooked bad pasta together on Sunday nights. He came to my work events and shook hands with my coworkers and told them he was proud of me. Then he got his first major commission, a multi-unit development deal that earned him more in 6 months than he'd made in the previous 2 years combined. And something shifted. Not suddenly. Gradually the way a house settles, slowly, imperceptibly, until one day you notice the door doesn't close quite right anymore. He stopped coming to my work events. He started taking calls during dinner. He started referring to my job as your little clinic, not cruelly, just casually, like it was self-evident that it didn't really count. One evening, I came home to tell him I'd been asked to lead the outpatient rehab program for a university athletics department. It was a big deal. It was the kind of thing I had worked toward for years. He was on the phone when I walked in. He held up one finger without looking at me. 15 minutes later, he hung up, poured a drink, and said, "Sorry, what were you saying?" I told him again. He nodded. "That's good, babe." Then he opened his laptop. I stood in the kitchen for a moment, waiting for something more. Then I went upstairs and sat on the edge of the bed and didn't cry, because it didn't feel like something cry-worthy yet. It felt like a minor disappointment. It felt survivable. That's the thing about slow erosion. Every single drop is survivable. It's only when you look back that you realize the stone is gone. By our 4th year, I had learned to edit myself in real time. I would start a sentence and catch the look on his face, that slight tightening around the eyes, that barely there exhale through the nose, and I would change course mid-thought. I stopped talking about my patients. I stopped sharing opinions about things he hadn't asked me about. I became very good at reading the room, at sensing when he needed to be the loudest voice and making sure I wasn't competition. My friends noticed before I did. My best friend from college pulled me aside at a birthday dinner once and said, quietly, "You used to be so loud." In a good way. Where did that go? I laughed it off. I told her I was just tired. She looked at me the way people look at something they can't fix and changed the subject. I told myself this was just what long-term relationships look like. I told myself that the butterflies settle and you find a comfortable rhythm. I told myself a lot of things. I found out on a Wednesday. Fig had knocked his phone off the charger in the night, and when I came downstairs in the morning, it was lying on the kitchen floor, screen cracked. I picked it up. I wasn't trying to look. I was trying to check if the screen was broken enough to need replacing before he woke up. But the phone had unlocked from my motion, and the message thread was already open. I read the name at the top. It was someone from his office, a leasing coordinator who had joined his team 8 months before. She was 24. I had met her once at a company happy hour. She'd had long dark hair and a confident handshake, and I had thought, absently, that she seemed sharp. The most recent message from her said, "He still doesn't see it. You're wasted on her." And his response, sent at 11,047 the previous night while I was asleep, 3 feet away from him, "I know. I've known for a while. I just need to find the right time." I set the phone down on the counter very carefully, the way you set down something fragile. My coffee was still brewing, the machine was making its normal sounds. Fig was turning circles on his bed in the corner. The whole world was completely ordinary, and I was standing in the middle of it with my hands going numb. I scrolled up. I told myself I wouldn't, but I did. It went back 7 months. They talked every day. Not just about what I assumed, though that was there too, enough of it to make my stomach turn, but about everything. Weekend plans. Inside jokes. His childhood, his frustrations at work, his ambitions. He talked to her the way he used to talk to me, and I was present in the thread in the way furniture is present in a room. Mentioned in passing. Managed around. There was one message where he called our marriage a situation I got into too young, and another where he said he'd have to be careful about the house because North Carolina is an equitable distribution state, and he didn't want to lose more than he had to. Not my heart, the house. I heard him start moving around upstairs. I closed the thread. I put the phone back exactly where I had found it. I poured my coffee. I scratched Fig behind the ears. And when my husband came downstairs, I handed him his phone and told him the screen had a hairline crack in the corner. He barely looked at me. "Thanks," he said. "I'll deal with it later." "Sure," I said. I drove to work. I saw 4 patients that morning. I helped a college soccer player regain strength in her reconstructed ACL and talked a retired postal worker through his rotator cuff exercises. I did everything correctly. I made notes. I smiled. And on my lunch break, I sat in my car in the parking deck and called my mother. I didn't tell her what I had seen. I just said, "Mom, if something really bad happened, if my marriage was over, what would I do?" There was a long pause. Then my mom said, in that careful way she has, "You would do what every woman in this family has done. You would figure it out, and you'd be okay." She didn't ask me anything else. She just said, "Call me when you're ready to talk." And she let me go. That evening, I called a family law attorney whose name I had found during my lunch break. Her office was across town. She had solid reviews and a no-nonsense bio photo, and those 2 things were enough for me. I got an appointment for the following Monday. The weekend was the strangest 2 days of my life. I cooked dinner. I watched television. I slept in the same bed. I smiled at his jokes. I was present in all the ways I was usually present, which he didn't seem to notice anyway, and I was also somewhere else entirely. I was already in the future. I was already planning. Monday morning, I went to the attorney's office before my first patient. She was a practical woman in her 50s who wore reading glasses on a chain and didn't waste words. I told her everything. She took notes. When I finished, she said, "You have grounds, and given the asset situation, we should move carefully. Do not make large withdrawals. Do not remove shared property. Just continue normally until we have a plan in place." I went home and I continued normally. Over the next 10 days, while he was at work, I quietly began separating what was mine, not the shared things. The attorney had been clear, but my grandmother's china that I'd brought into the marriage. My professional files. The jewelry my mother had given me over the years, the pieces that had nothing to do with him. I found a storage unit 6 miles away, and I moved things gradually, 1 cardboard box at a time, on mornings when he was already gone. I did not take the engagement ring. I put it in an envelope and left it on the counter. I thought about it later, what an impractical decision that was. But at the time, I needed to leave it. I needed to walk out of that marriage holding nothing of his. I did take the tote bag full of tools I had bought myself. I took Fig, and I took my half of our joint savings account, exactly half, wire transferred as the attorney instructed, the morning before the papers were served. He called me 40 minutes after the process server left his office. I was sitting in my car outside a coffee shop, waiting for exactly this. I answered. "What is this?" It wasn't a question. His voice was flat with shock. "Divorce papers," I said. "Laurel." He made my name sound like an accusation. "What are you doing? We need to talk about this." "I know about her," I said. "I know about all of it. 7 months of messages. I know what you said about the house." I kept my voice steady. "I had rehearsed this. I'm not calling to fight. I'm calling to tell you the papers are real, and my attorney will be in touch." A long silence. Then, "You went through my phone." "Your phone was on the kitchen floor," I said. "It unlocked in my hand." "That's not." "I have to go," I said. "Take care of yourself." I hung up. My hands were shaking slightly. I sat there until they stopped. Then I ordered a coffee and drank it in the car and watched the people walking by on the sidewalk, all of them moving through their ordinary days. And I thought, I am 32 years old, and I am starting completely over, and I have no idea what that looks like yet. It looked like my aunt's spare room, first of all. My aunt lives 40 minutes outside of Asheville in a house she has owned for 20 years, surrounded by hemlocks and a vegetable garden that she treats with the devotion other people reserve for religion. She's my dad's sister, never married, deeply opinionated about tomatoes and local politics, and she told me to come the same day I called her. "Bring the dog," she said. "I'll make chili." Her spare room had a quilt on the bed and a window that looked out at the tree line. The first morning, I woke up before dawn and lay there listening to the birds start up in the hemlocks, and I couldn't remember the last time I had woken up without that baseline tension in my shoulders, that low-level brace, like I was always slightly waiting for something. My aunt didn't push me to talk. She fed me and gave me tasks, weeding, hauling compost, painting the shed, and let me fill the silence when I was ready. She told me once, passing me a coffee on the porch, "You look like a person who's been holding their breath for a very long time." She didn't say anything else about it. She didn't have to. I commuted back to Charlotte for work, 40 minutes each way, which should have been exhausting and was, actually, in a productive way. It was time that belonged completely to me. I listened to podcasts. I called my mom. I let myself think about what I wanted the next chapter to look like without immediately talking myself out of it. My attorney called periodically with updates. He had gotten a divorce lawyer of his own. He was contesting the asset split. He wanted a larger share of the equity in the townhouse because he had made the larger income. It was going to take a while. I told her to proceed as needed. I threw myself into work. The university athletics program had officially offered me the position, and I took it. New hours, expanded caseload, a title on my office door. My supervisor told me in my first week that I had a reputation for being good with athletes who were struggling mentally with recovery, not just physically. She said it like a compliment. I filed it away and thought about it later. When you've spent years being told your work is small, being told it's good, genuinely, specifically good, is disorienting in the best way. 4 months after I moved out, I found a rental. A small house in a neighborhood east of Asheville proper, with a covered porch and a yard big enough for fig and old hardwood floors that creaked in a way that felt like character rather than neglect. I signed the lease on a Friday afternoon and sat on the empty floor of the living room for a while, figs sprawled across my legs, looking at the light coming through the front windows. It wasn't impressive. It wasn't the craftsman townhouse with the hand-painted door, but every single thing in it was going to be mine. I started over the way you start over when you're in your 30s, and you don't have the luxury of dramatic reinvention. Slowly, practically. I bought furniture from Facebook Marketplace and thrift stores, and one beautiful reading chair that I paid too much for and don't regret at all. I cooked for myself. Real meals, not the abbreviated versions I used to make when I knew he wouldn't notice what I'd put into them. I called friends I'd let go quiet. I learned that the women I'd thought I had drifted from had just been waiting for me to come back. 6 months after I left, my former colleague Gwen, a PT who had moved to Atlanta the previous year, called to tell me she had just run into my ex at a charity golf tournament. She'd heard he was seeing someone new. "Someone from his office," she said carefully. "I think they're pretty serious. I didn't know if he'd want to know." "Is she the one from before?" I asked. A pause. "I think so, yes." "Okay," I said. "I hope it works out for them." Gwen was quiet for a moment. "That's it? That's all you have to say?" "I mean it," I said, and I mostly did. The anger had burned itself out somewhere around month 3. What was left wasn't forgiveness exactly. It was more like indifference, which felt healthier. He didn't live in my chest anymore. He was just a fact of my history. The wedding announcement came through a mutual contact 8 months later. A Saturday in September at a venue outside of Charleston. Very upscale. 300 guests. The kind of event that gets coverage in the local society pages. I had a full day of patience that Saturday. I came home, fed Fig, ate leftover soup for dinner, and fell asleep reading before 10 o'clock. I did not think about the wedding. I was so unbothered that I actually found it slightly funny. I had expected to feel something more, and I didn't. The call that changed everything came 3 days later. It was from a man named Earl Whitfield. Earl was 71 years old, a retired CPA who had handled my grandmother's estate when she passed 4 years ago. He was also, in the way that small professional worlds overlap, loosely connected to a couple of my ex-husband's early investors, people he'd courted when he was still building his business, before the bigger deals came in. Earl had been invited to the wedding as a courtesy, the kind of name on a guest list that represents a relationship rather than a close friendship. Earl and I had stayed in occasional contact after the estate settled, because he was the kind of person who sends birthday cards and checks in at holidays, and because my grandmother had genuinely liked him, and that counted for something. When he called, 3 days after the wedding, I assumed it was one of those check-ins. "Laurel," he said, and his voice had that particular tone that means someone is trying not to sound pleased with themselves. "I was at the wedding Saturday." "I heard there was one," I said. "I thought you'd want to know," he said, "that it was a very eventful evening." He told it the way a good storyteller tells something, taking his time, the context first. The venue was beautiful. The food was expensive. Her dress was elaborate. He was working the room in the way he always did, shaking hands, making sure important people noticed him. Earl had been seated near the front with some of the investor contacts. After dinner, during the toasts, my ex gave a speech. Earl described it as the kind of speech where the groom talks mostly about himself. He made references to moving past people who held him back. He made a joke about upgrading. The people around Earl laughed politely. Earl did not. Later in the evening, after the champagne had been flowing for a couple of hours, Earl was standing in a small cluster that included my ex and 2 of the investors. My ex was talking about properties, about his trajectory, about where he saw himself in 5 years. Earl said he just stood there listening for a moment, and then something settled in him, some private decision, and he set down his glass. "Congratulations," Earl told him, loudly enough that it carried, though I have to say, I was surprised to see you looking so comfortable, given everything that's happened with your portfolio since the split. My ex looked at him. "What do you mean?" "Well," Earl said, "I handled the estate trust for the Haynes family. Laurel's grandmother's trust included a land parcel in Henderson County that nobody paid much attention to for years, about 18 acres on a ridge above Hendersonville. It wasn't worth much when your marriage was dissolving, so I expect nobody mentioned it during the asset negotiations." He paused. "But Laurel's grandmother had the foresight to hold it unencumbered, and when the county approved that new conservation easement incentive program last spring, well, the appraised value is a different story now, significantly different." There was a silence at the table. "How different?" one of the investors asked. Earl said he just smiled. "Let's say Laurel is doing considerably better financially than anyone in this room probably assumed." My ex went pale. Earl said it was remarkable, the color actually leaving his face. He looked at Earl, then at the investors, then across the room at his new wife. "Is that true?" the investor asked him directly. "You didn't know about a land parcel in the estate?" He started explaining. He said the parcel had been disclosed, that it was valued at almost nothing, that this was new information. He was right. Technically, the parcel had been disclosed, and at the time of our divorce, it was assessed at a modest number that neither of our attorneys had prioritized. But what it looked like in that moment, in that company, was a man who had pushed through a fast divorce settlement without looking carefully at what he was walking away from. An investor's worst nightmare. A man who doesn't check his numbers. Earl told me one of the investors pulled out his phone right there at the table. By the end of the night, 2 of the men in that cluster had made quiet calls. The story that moved through the reception was that my ex had left the smarter deal on the table in his rush to get out. that he had traded solid long-term value for something flashier and come out the loser. His new wife had hurt the word considerably and the phrase 18 acres, and she was asking questions by the time they got back to the table. I sat on my porch with Fig in my lap, listening to Earl tell me all of this, and I started to laugh. Not a mean laugh, just a pure, startled, genuine laugh, the kind that comes from the gut. "Earl," I said, "I didn't even know about the land in Greece." "I know," he said. "That's why it worked so beautifully." He had received the updated appraisal 2 weeks before and had planned to call me that week anyway. He would send me the documentation. The numbers were real. After I hung up, I sat outside for a long time. It was early October and the air had gone cool and the trees were just starting to change. Fig dozed in a patch of evening light. I thought about the math of the last 8 months. The long commutes, the rented moving van, the thrift store furniture, the nights I'd felt genuinely uncertain whether I had made the right call. I hadn't planned any of it to work out this way. I hadn't plotted or schemed. I had just refused to be reduced any further. And I had left. And I had built something real while he was busy building an image. The call started a week later, a number I didn't recognize, but I knew. I let it go to voicemail 3 times. On the 4th call, I answered. He sounded the way I had never heard him sound before. Not controlled, not smooth, just raw. He told me the investors had pulled back. He told me the new development deal had stalled because 2 key backers had suddenly gotten cautious about his judgment. He told me his new wife was asking pointed questions about finances that he couldn't answer in ways that satisfied her. He said all of this in a rush, like if he got it all out fast enough, it would make the next part easier. "I made a mistake," he said. "Laurel, I need you to know that." "I believe you," I said. "I'm not calling about the land," he said. And I almost laughed again, because of course that was the first thing he needed to clarify. "I'm not trying to make a claim. I know how it works. I think I didn't understand what I was giving up. Not just the assets. I'm talking about." "I know what you're talking about," I said. "I miss you," he said. "And then, I could come up there. We could talk." "No," I said, simply. No anger, no elaborate explanation. "Laurel." "You didn't miss me," I said. "You miss what I held together for you. That's a different thing. And I'm not available to hold it together anymore." He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice had shifted back toward hard. "You were fine with being invisible," he said. "You let it happen." It was a strange thing to say to someone you were trying to win back. But I understood it. It was the only remaining move, making it my fault. "You're right that I stayed too long," I said. "That's something I'll carry. But this conversation is over." I hung up. I didn't block the number immediately. I waited a week, in case there was something practical to address. He didn't call again. It has been over a year now. The conservation easement paperwork is settled. A land trust organization in the county reached out about a potential partnership program. Essentially, they lease the ridge property for conservation access in exchange for a significant annual payment and substantial tax benefits. My attorney and Earl worked through it together. It is, by any measure, the best financial outcome I could have stumbled into by doing nothing except refusing to sign away something my grandmother left me. I am still at the athletics program. I got a small feature in a regional sports medicine journal this spring, a piece on return to sports psychology that my supervisor submitted on my behalf. My name in print, on something I built. I have the little house. I have the porch and the creaking floors and Fig, who has now destroyed 2 reading pillows and shows no remorse. I have my aunt 40 minutes away and my mother 2 hours east, and a handful of friendships I treated badly for a few years and have been carefully rebuilding ever since. I heard through the network, the way you hear things in small professional worlds, that his new wife has filed for separation. I didn't go looking for that information. It arrived the way rain arrives, without being invited. I felt nothing triumphant about it. Mostly I felt a passing sadness for her, the particular sadness of recognizing a situation from the inside. I don't think much about what he's doing now. He's somewhere making a different version of the same mistakes probably, or maybe he's learning from them. Either way, it's not mine to carry. Someone asked me recently, A younger colleague, a woman in her late 20s, going through something similar. What the turning point had been. What made me finally leave. I thought about it for a moment. I thought about the Wednesday morning and the phone and the messages. I thought about standing in the kitchen with coffee going cold in my hand. I stopped thinking of it as a turning point, I said. I stopped waiting for the dramatic moment that would make leaving feel justified. I just decided that my ordinary days were worth protecting. That was enough. She looked at me like she was writing it down somewhere inside herself. I hope she does. I stood on my porch last weekend in the early morning, coffee in both hands, watching the mist come off the hills to the east. Fig was investigating something suspicious at the edge of the yard. The light was doing that thing it does in October in the mountains, low and gold, and a little rueful, like it knows it's about to leave. I am 33 years old. I am divorced. I am alone in a rented house with a dog who eats throw pillows, and I have never once woken up in this house dreading the day. Not once. I didn't burn anything down on my way out. I didn't issue ultimatums or make dramatic speeches. I just stopped being the person who made his life comfortable, and without that, his life became exactly what it had always been underneath. Something he couldn't sustain on his own. Sometimes the quietest thing you can do is simply stop. I used to think justice was loud. I thought it arrived the way storms do, announced, dramatic, impossible to ignore. What I didn't understand, back when I was still making dinner for a man who couldn't look up from his phone long enough to hear my news, was that the real reckoning is almost always quiet. It accumulates in the dark, the way interest does. And then one day it's just there. Earl didn't set out to expose anyone. He's a retired accountant from Henderson County who sends birthday cards and liked my grandmother. He went to that wedding as a courtesy and came home with a story he felt I deserved to hear. That's the thing about living with integrity, not as a performance. Not because you expect a reward, but because it's simply who you are. It tends to build relationships with people who do the same. I didn't plan for Earl to be in that room. I didn't plant him there. He was just someone I had been decent to over years without agenda, and when the moment came, he was decent back. That's how it actually works in my experience. Not fate, not the universe balancing a cosmic ledger. Just the long, slow return on how you treat people and what you choose to do when no one's watching. When I sat in my car in that parking deck on my lunch break, right after I found the messages, I had a choice. I could have sent screenshots. I could have called her. I could have made the whole thing loud and messy and cathartic in the moment. I didn't. Not because I was better than my anger. I wasn't. Not entirely. But because some part of me understood that the people who use chaos as a weapon eventually get swallowed by it. I wanted out, not a war. That decision took more out of me than the anger would have. It required me to think clearly when everything in me wanted to react. That kind of discipline, learning to act from your values instead of your wounds, is something I'm still practicing. It doesn't come naturally. It's a choice you make over and over in small moments, and it compounds. What I'm proudest of isn't a land parcel or the conservation easement or the fact that two investors quietly reconsidered their opinion of the man who dismissed me as an afterthought. I'm proudest of the Tuesday morning I drove 40 minutes to work after 3 hours of sleep, saw 7 patients, did the work well, and came home to a house that was mine. That was the hardest kind of courage. Not the dramatic exit, but the ordinary persistence of showing up anyway, building something real out of what was left, when it would have been so much easier to collapse. Laurel from 2 years ago would not recognize this version of herself. She would be relieved, I think. She spent so long editing herself down to fit into someone else's frame that she forgot she had her own. I don't know exactly what's next. I know I have work I'm good at, a porch I love, a dog with no respect for, throw pillows, and a few relationships I've tended carefully and plan to keep. I know that the most important thing I did was simply decide my ordinary days were worth protecting. That turned out to be enough.